Hi guys, it's Pamela. You might know me as the Fiber Sprite, and since it's Halloween, I wanted to share something that a lot of people might find spooky, but I'm going to show you why it's not spooky at all. I'm going to cut a hole in this hand-knit, hand-spun sweater. So this is a sweater that it's actually been in hibernation for about a year, and I've re-knit a couple things on it and put on the button band, and now I've decided that I want pockets. So when I knit the sweater, I thought I was going to pick up and knit what's called a patch pocket, and it was going to be rather large, kind of like the pocket on a hoodie, and I've decided that instead I would like to have a different kind of pocket. I want a more traditional vertical pocket that I can just stick my cell phone, post-it notes, keys, pens into, and not worry about them falling out on the side, which is a problem that I experience. So I'm going to, because I don't want to knit on a patch pocket vertically, just because I feel like those stand out a little bit too much. So instead I'm going to cut a hole right here and pick out part of a row of stitches and then go from there. Now you might have heard of steeking. That is a technique where you cut vertically, and it's usually used when you're knitting in the round and you either you want to knit a sweater without purling, and then you want to turn it into a cardigan later, or maybe you are knitting in color work where it is much easier to go in the round. So you can cut, if you wanted to have a button band, you could cut vertically, and some people even use it for their sleeves, their arm openings in a sweater. So, but this is different because instead of going vertically and then sort of rolling it under and securing it with stitching, I'm actually going to cut a hole in the middle of the knitting, and I'm going to unpick it from side to side, and then I'm going to pick up and knit from those live stitches that I create. So I've already made one pocket, and I want to make sure that the pocket on the other side matches in placement. So I know that I've already counted, and I know that I went 33 rows up, and it's about 12 rows in. So I've already counted that, and what I've done is I start about where I think I'm going to put the center of the pocket, and I count up 33 rows, and then I placed a marker in that stitch, and that's the stitch that I'm going to cut. And then I count in 12 rows, and I place a marker right here, and that's just a reminder to me to tell me when to stop. Now the pocket itself is 32 stitches wide, so I want to make sure that that's what I've got, and so I put another marker on the other end, again telling me when to stop. You definitely need to have an anchor point to know how far in your sweater goes. I like to go from the middle and work outwards because that gives me more yarn to weave in the ends. So I've got my markers, everything's placed. I'm going to put my right hand, I am left-handed, so I'm going to use my right hand as a base, and I'll be cutting with my left hand, but you could of course do this in the opposite direction. So I'm going to spread out my knitting just a little bit so that I can really see that stitch. And you know, this is knitting, it's not fine china, it's not going to fall apart on you. So you can tug at it and it'll spring back, but I do want to be careful to just be cutting that one stitch that's right there. And I'm going to leave my marker in it just to help me out. And I'm going to go in there with my scissors and I'm going to get one of the legs of the stitch and I'm going to cut. And right away you see, you can tug at that marker a little bit, and I just made a hole in my knitting. So this is where the fun begins. So I've got some double pointed needles that are a couple sizes smaller than the needles that I knit the sweater with. You could also use circular needles, or you could use, these are stitch holders that snap on to both ends, and then you've got the cover for it that just fell on the floor. This is, I'm not using this, it's really convenient, but the size is just a little bit too thick and sticky for what I want right now. So I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to use these nice double pointed needles. So I've got 3 here because I'm going to use one of them to help me sort of pick out the row of stitches. Now, I learned this technique from Elizabeth Zimmerman, and she insists that you could pick out your whole entire row and then go back in, and if you're using wool, which is fairly sticky, that it would, all your live stitches would be sitting there waiting for you as perfectly as they were when you knit the sweater. And that is true. They will, they won't go too far, but I find that sometimes I have a tendency to lose a stitch, whether it's because I am not paying attention, or maybe I'm pulling a little bit too hard on this thread or this piece of yarn, and sometimes it can just drop down to the next row. So I find that doing this one at a time as I go along just gives me more control, gives me more peace of mind, lets me know that I'm not missing anything. I'm not going to have to go back in later and do any extra repair work. So this, at this point, looks a little bit scary because this hole is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But that's okay. You need to have a hole to make a pocket. And it's actually a lot like, if you've ever made socks, it's actually a lot like an Afterthought heel, where you don't want to make the heel while you're knitting the socks, and so you go in later, you just cut out that row where the heel goes and knit in the heel. And that's especially great if you wanted to use like contrasting colors, which you could absolutely do with this technique for the pocket, but I'm going to make it the same color because that's my choice. So you just keep going until you get to that marker you placed at the end. And just for the sake of speed on this tutorial, I'm going to start moving in the opposite direction. So once I go all the way across to this marker, I'll have picked up about half of the stitches, and then I'll want to go in the opposite direction. And so I just sort of pick at it until I find that spot where I made that cut in the stitch, and I just pick up stitches in the opposite direction. Now, I'm not being super careful here about making sure I get my stitches on the needle in the right direction. When you pick up stitches, or when you're knitting in general, you always want your stitches to be in the right direction on the needle. And that's so that you don't twist stitches. They can be used, you can use twisted stitches, they can be decorative, but you always, if you're using twisted stitches, you want them to be twisted on purpose and not on accident. But like I said, I'm not being too careful about that right now, because I found that for me, when I go back and knit it, that's when I'm going to correct it. So you just keep going and going and going until you get all your stitches picked up. And for me, that's 32 stitches. And I'm just going to keep at this. Keep going. And you can see that I'm sort of using this third needle to do a couple things. It's helping me pick up those stitches and put them on the needles, but I'm also using it to get in there and pick out this row that I'm opening up. Now I don't want to, this tail is going to get a little bit long by the time I get to the end of it. And that's okay. I'm going to keep this tail, I'm not going to cut it, because I want to make sure that I have enough to weave in later on, so I can make sure that it's secured, because I'm not taking out this entire row all the way around the sweater. If I was doing that, I'd basically be cutting the sweater in half. But here what I'm doing is I'm just taking out a portion of this row, and I want to make sure that the rest of the row doesn't unravel on accident. Now this is wool, and wool is known for being fairly grippy because of the structure of the fibers. So it's not a huge concern that it would unravel, but I'm hoping that this sweater is going to last me for years and years and years and years, and so I want it to be strong in every way possible. So as you go along, you're just going to get into a little rhythm as you unpick the stitches. And the row goes through each stitch twice. That's just how knitting works. So as long as I'm getting this stitch that I'm picking up at some point, see I just lost it there, but I'm going to scoop it back up. As long as I get it at some point before I move on to the next stitch that I pick up, it'll be fine. There's no need to worry about which time when you pick it out that it comes onto your needle. Just as long as it gets there, sooner rather than later. And we just keep on going. Now, I'm going to stop right here just for now. And so once I get all of the stitches onto my needles, I'll have picked up 32 stitches on each needle. So 32 stitches from the bottom row, 32 stitches from the top row. These tails from the row that I unpicked, I'm just going to keep them out of the way, and then I'm going to join on another ball of yarn, and I'm going to knit from one needle at a time. So from the bottom needle, I'm going to be knitting the edging on my pocket, which here is 4 rows of garter stitch, and that's just to match the garter stitch detail that I have here at the hem. I have it on the cuffs of the sleeves, and then I have it again on the button band. So I'm going to just continue with that theme, and then I'm going to make sure that that's knit on the same size needles that I used to knit the sweater. That's just my design choice. It really is quite flexible. If you wanted a firmer edge, you could use a smaller needle. But for the lining of the pocket, I'm going to knit down, and I'm going to knit that in stockinette stitch for the lining of the pocket, which is what I did on the other side. And that will create, if I use a smaller knitting needle, which I'm actually going to use this size needle to do that lining, it's going to create a firmer fabric. And I like to have a firmer fabric in at least one part of my pockets, just because that gives it a stronger base. Pockets can tend to stretch out if you put a lot of things in them. They might get a lot of strain on them. So you want to make sure that it's nice and firm somewhere. And then once I've done all of that knitting, I'll have 2 flaps, and I'll just sew them down. So this has already been sewn down, but so originally this was a flap, it wasn't connected, and so I just sewed it down right there, and then on the inside I sewed it down, going straight down, so that then I had a pocket. So that's what I'm going to do on this side. I'm going to keep on unpicking stitches until I get to these markers. Then I'll count and make sure that I've got 32. If you mess up, if you've got 33, or if you're 1 stitch too far to the left or the right, that's not a big deal. Knitting is stretchy, it's forgiving, but you do want to be in the ballpark within a stitch or 2, just so that things don't look off. This is a fairly fine yarn that was knit on smaller needles, so I have a little bit more wiggle room than you might with a sweater that's knit at a bulkier gauge. If you were dealing with 3 stitches to the inch, it would be really obvious if you were half an inch off. But here I've got a little bit more wiggle room, but I'm still going to try to be as precise as I can. That's it for today's tutorial. When I come back, I'll actually have picked up all of these stitches, and I'll show you what goes into knitting up and knitting down and sewing down the pocket. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. You can find me at fibersprite.com or on Instagram as thefibersprite. And I hope to hear from you. Thanks! Until next time.